I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EAWorldView on Syria. Misunderstanding the Insurgency. Yet again this week, the headlines in newspapers, the comments from pundits and analysts, is how extremists and jihadists are taking over the Syrian insurgency. Only this week, in a seminar here at Birmingham University, one leading academic said that in fact, because things would be so much worse if these extremists came into power, we might as well just let President Assad stay, even if he was responsible for last month's chemical weapons attacks. But is this really the case? Let's consider two significant developments that have been misunderstood by most in the media and most commenting on events. The first is in northern Syria, where 13 groups united last week to form a common military front. They are led by a large brigade named Liwa al-Tawhid, which is known as a brigade linked to, in fact, the so-called moderate Free Syrian Army. Yet despite this, the label has been that the extremists have formed a common cause that is directed not necessarily against President Assad, but against the West. That is a complete misrepresentation. This front was founded for two reasons, both of which need to be understood. Reason number one. In his statement, the front renounced the leadership of the opposition Syrian National Coalition and the military leadership of the Supreme Military Council. Now, on the surface, this was portrayed as an anti-Western move because both the coalition and the Supreme Military Committee have been backed by the United States and European powers. But in fact, what was being said here is that these groups were increasingly frustrated with the coalition, with the committee, for not delivering arms, for not delivering leadership, for not organizing the effort against President Assad. For months, brigades have complained that they have lacked the necessary resources to really carry out the fight, that there has been favoritism among certain units, and that many of the military leaders in exile really haven't shown any interest in coming back inside the country. That discontent was reinforced by the United States' decision not to intervene militarily in Syria, not necessarily through airstrikes, but through delivering significant arms to the insurgency. If the coalition and the committee couldn't deliver U.S. support, what good are they? But there is a second, equally important reason why these 13 groups banded together. They now have another enemy. It is not just the Assad regime, it is the foreign fighters of the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. The Islamic State of Iraq and Asham has become increasingly prominent in the north. In the eyes of these groups, what would happen is that they would fight, capture regime stocks, capture area, and then the Islamic State of Iraq would sweep in, trying to take credit and, more importantly, trying to establish control. One example of this occurred last month in the town of Azaz near the Turkish border, when the Islamic State of Iraq got into a firefight with a brigade of the Free Syrian Army, killing several of its members, and then kicking it out of the town. The 13 groups have come together, in effect, because they don't want to be pushed around by the so-called foreign fighters, especially because in their eyes, they are fighting not for any foreign group, but for Syria itself. But this wasn't the only event to watch. There was a second major merger of military forces last week, which occurred near Damascus. Almost 50 insurgent groups declared they would unify their efforts. The leading element in this group was Liwa al-Islam, which is a brigade that is led by a Saudi-based Syrian family. But most importantly, isn't just a single brigade like Liwa al-Islam. It is this new army of Islam, and why it is decided to unite now. It is simply because it is fighting a battle to the death against regime forces. In the past year, insurgents have held territory encircling the capital, but the regime has continued to hit them with airstrikes, with artillery, and yes, with chemical weapons. In the face of those continued offensives, the brigades have basically decided it is far better to die or to succeed together than to do so apart. That was why they made their declaration, not because this is some kind of new Islamist force which is dedicated not only to fighting President Assad, but us non-Islamists outside the country. What's the conclusion here? Sure, it's simple, it's easy if you're a newspaper and analyst to declare that the insurgency has been taken over by these radical groups, by Al-Qaeda-linked elements, by extremists who in fact we can no longer support. It's simple, but it's wrong. As these two examples indicate, what determines the developments, military, political, and social, are local factors. These groups fight together not because they want to establish a caliphate or Sharia law. They fight because they see an increasingly desperate battle against the Assad regime, and indeed against foreign fighters who have come in from the Islamic State of Iraq. It's a much more difficult story to tell, but it's the essential one. I'm Scott Lucas. This has been today's EA Worldview on Syria.